roll.
Yep. Hey everyone, this is Nimra Laveau. I'm very happy to bring onto the stage now Jason Mankey, and he is going to share a little bit about Yule and his book that's coming up. It is Yule in August, this time of year. So take it away.
Wow. Well, thank you. Forever's here. So you can't really see anybody, so it's always strange. You know, you don't really know who you're talking to. So I feel like it's really not a good time to talk about Yule for several hours. So my thought is I'll talk to you a little bit about books, and I've written 7 books now, so there's a ton of books, and read a little bit from these books and share things and take questions and just chat and hang out. I thought really that would be sort of the best thing to do. I mean, I don't really have like a giant, there it is, show participants. I guess we have 1 participant. So.
Well, you may not be able to see. We currently have 3 watching, so you'll just see my number, but you definitely have some people coming on in.
Yeah. So, you know, my thought is if you got questions or whatever, I'll be happy to answer them. I will talk to you a little bit about the Yule book. And I would love to share the Yule book, but it's so weird. Like Llewellyn is really behind on getting books out, and I wanted to have one to like go, hello, look, it's Jason's book. But I don't, because they're so far behind because of COVID. It's supposed to be out in 2 weeks. We'll see if it actually meets its date. They just got into the warehouse the other day, which is exciting for me, which means soon-ish I should have some. But of course, I've already written it, so I have like lots of, you know, versions of it and stuff, and I'm happy to share a bit of it. I've started writing this book though because I love the holiday season. It's my favorite time of the year. I know like for a lot of witches, they love Christmas the most, or not Christmas, but they love Halloween and Samhain the most. And for me, the most pagan of all the seasons is really Yuletide season. That doesn't mean that our ancestors 2,500 years ago were celebrating Yule like we do today. But what it means is that a lot of the traditions and things that they were doing around the winter holidays are still with us. So when we think of Samhain, we think of jack-o'-lanterns. Well, those are from North America, so obviously those aren't thousands of years old. That's not how it went. And Samhain, the ancient Celts were far more worried about the Fae than they were worried about communing with ancient spirits. But so a lot of the things that we associate with Samhain are really kind of more modern than ancient. But when it comes to Yule, pretty much everything has some sort of ancient precedent or a little bit of ancient thing, because people loved early winter and they loved the holidays and they loved the traditions around those holidays. And when I moved from being a Christian to being a pagan witch, I was a little worried that I was going to lose all of my Samhain shit or all my Yule shit. And apparently that wasn't the case, because it was all there all along, with only a couple of exceptions. Most everything that you do at Yule has some sort of ancient precedent. So I think that's really cool and really neat. And I think that's kind of one of the best things about this particular time or when we get to that particular time of year, because we're not quite there yet, obviously. So I really love Yule. And I love Yule not just because I love the winter solstice. I love Yuletide because I love everything that happens from Thanksgiving in the United States all the way through till like the first or second week of January, where they used to still actually do some holiday things. So I love all of that so very, very, very much. And I wanted to write a book about it. So this is Mickey Mueller's little book of Halloween. And Llewellyn has a series of books known as little book of, and there's like little book of chakras, little book of tarot, and they're meant to be sort of introduction beginner things. And I saw Mickey's little book of Halloween, and I was like, well, that's really great. I bet I could write one for the Yule season. And so I sent like Llewellyn a little note and said, I'd love to write this book about Yule. And they responded back, like, if you write it in a month, we'll print it next year. And I said, absolutely not. I don't want to write anything that quickly. So I had a year to write it, but then it comes out this year. It could have come out in 2019. But I like the idea of the little book because these books aren't just history. There's like crafts and things to do in them. And there's kind of a house style, how this series goes. And I thought it would be really relevant for Yuletide. And so I was just excited to get the chance. And I was excited that they liked my idea to write this book. There's kind of, my little book of Yule has sort of 5 different sections in it. The first is there's a section on the history of holidays and all of the holidays that are a part of Yuletide. So it's called Llewellyn's Little Book of Yule. It's not called like Llewellyn's Little Book of Pagan Yule. So it's not like 100% a pagan or a witch book. It's 100% a magical book about however you celebrate the season, there's something magical for you to do. So there's like, some Christian shit in there. There's a couple of mentions of Hanukkah. There's a little mention of Kwanzaa in there. There's a bunch of different stuff. So it's really kind of broad. And the first chapter is about all of those holidays and the history of those holidays. The second chapter is about things that I think are really sort of integral in the history of Yuletide. Things like Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol and the spirits of Christmas past, present, and yet to come. I mean, you can't escape that particular story every December. It's really a part of things. And I talk a little bit about like the nativity and some of its parallels in paganism and, how you can magically use that at Yuletide. There's a bit about misrule, which is one of the oldest holiday traditions. Misrule is about breaking the social order, and it's about doing things that you would not normally get away with every Christmas. So I love misrule. It was also about people who were of less means being able to get something from the nobility. So in ancient Rome during the Saturnalia, slave owners would wait on their slaves during the Saturnalia. And later on, like in medieval places, peasants would go and get gifts from landowners around the Christmas season. And that's all part of misrule. Wassailing is a kind of nice version of misrule, because in misrule is if you did not give something to others, you were going to be penalized, usually with vandalism or something of that nature. And ancient wassailing, or even just wassailing from 150 years ago, was really about going door to door, if you were poor, to people who were rich, and saying to them, hey, it's time for you to give us a little bit of our fair share, and if you give us good food and good drink or money, we'll do a small song for you, or we'll give you some of our cheap booze, or something of that nature. And that was all related to misrule. And if people didn't play along, again, petty vandalism and other things. So that's sort of the second part of the book, these sort of bigger traditions. The third part of the book is on gift givers. I love magical gift givers. There's Santa, which we all know, probably the most, but there's more than Santa. There's a lot of different figures from across the centuries. There are Christmas witches. There is like a Christmas angel that gives gifts door to door in parts of Germany. Of course, there's my favorite figure, which is the Krampus, who is the Christmas devil, so to speak. There's also terrible traditions that I hate in there, like Elf on a Shelf, which I've always found super insulting. Claims to be an ancient tradition, and it was invented in 2005. So it talks about those people from history, the gift givers and their assistants, and then how you can sort of utilize them in your own magical practice. I'm one of those people who thinks that if people honor something, it's probably real in some way. So to me, like Santa Claus is kind of a deity in his own way. And so there are little exercises about invoking Santa, using Befana to clean your space. The fourth section of the book is about Yuletide decorations, things like the history of trees and wreaths and holly and mistletoe, and then again a little bit about how to utilize those things magically and to do stuff with those. And I'm kind of excited about that part. And then the last is about holidays that take place after the winter solstice and Christmas. We don't think about it very much in America anymore, but for a long time, the Yule season went much further than it does now. The Yule season would go into sometimes the second week of January. In many parts of England, they would celebrate what they called Plough Monday on the first Monday after Twelfth Night. Twelfth Night was January 5th. It was a pre-celebration of the Epiphany, allegedly when the wise men came to see Jesus on January 6th. So if you were lucky and Epiphany was on January 6th, then the holiday season got to extend until the 13th. So you got like a whole extra week of holiday. If you were not lucky and Epiphany was on Sunday, then on January 7th, you'd celebrate Plough Monday, then go back to work on the Tuesday. But it was a really kind of a cool holiday that they made the holiday season longer. And then Twelfth Night, which happened right before that, was a hugely popular holiday in parts of Europe and England for a very, very long time. And it was actually bigger than Christmas for a couple of centuries. It was the sort of epitome of the Christmas season. It was the very end of the 12 days of Christmas. So it was the very end of being able to get drunk for 12 days in a row. And they were going to miss being drunk for 12 days in a row. So they were very sad, and it became a huge holiday. And it was a holiday where people gave gifts to others and stuff. Everything that we associate with Christmas was once celebrated on 12th day. In medieval courts, sometimes the Christmas season would begin as early as November 1st and then go all the way till Candlemas on February 2nd. So if people think the holidays are long now, they were once even longer and crazier because they had nothing else to do. The holidays were either the best of times or the worst of times in medieval and early modern Europe. They were the best of times because the apples and the wheat and the barley, the beer and cider that people were making in the fall was ready to drink. So there was a lot of festivity. There was also a lot of meat on hand because they would cull the herds in November. And then you could store the meat because it was cold outside, so it wouldn't rot very quickly. So you would freeze the meat just outside, and then you could eat it for an extended period of time, which was really, really rare in these places. So it was a party. The Norse, when they celebrated the original Yule, for them it was also a party for many of the same reasons. The mead was ready, there was fresh meat to eat, and there was just nothing but cold outside. So you might as well sit back and do a lot of heavy drinking, a lot of eating. It could be the worst of times, though, if your harvest wasn't very good beforehand and you were a little bit worried that you might not last the winter, because there's really not much you can do in the winter. You can hunt for some game, but other than that, there's really not any other food sources. So it could be a very, very scary time. There was a period when people were celebrating Yule, especially, where it was a night for ghost stories, and a lot of the activity that we kind of associate really with Samhain was a part of a lot of Yule things. It's worth noting that Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, in the original title, also includes a ghost story, because there are several ghosts, and it was very popular to tell ghost stories around the Christmas season. And of course, then too, when I talk about like Christmas and Yule extending a little further, New Year's is a big holiday and has been for a very, very long time. A lot of the way that we celebrate Yuletide today comes from the Roman celebration of the January calends. The calends were a celebration of the first of the month of every month. For Rome, when you changed months, it was an particularly exciting period of time. So, they always celebrated, but the January calends were really big, and they were a lot like Saturnalia, a lot of the same decorations, and they gave presents at the January calends. And to a lot of places, New Year's Day was the day to extend Christmas presents. If you were living in Victorian England, Queen Victoria would have sent you a card for New Year's Day, and it would have been customary to open your, quote, Christmas presents on January 1st and not December 25th. So it saddens me greatly that in the United States, we end Yule very fast. Like, if you've ever been to Target on the 27th of December, they're taking all the Christmas stuff down, or it's already down. It's already marked off 50%, and they're putting all of the Valentine's Day stuff up. And the holidays were supposed to be a long, extended season. It was not supposed to be just about one day and about one thing. It was supposed to be about many things, and it was supposed to last for at least about 2 weeks, if not longer. So always very sad that sort of happened. So that's a little bit about Llewellyn's little book of Yule, and it should be out in 2 weeks. As I said, I'm very excited about it because I love the holiday season so much. It was kind of a difficult book to write, though, because I was writing it in April and May and June, and then doing kind of the cleanup work on it in August. And it's really hard to focus on that holiday sort of energy when it's 100 degrees outside in August. And I would listen to Christmas carols and stuff, and my wife would come home and make fun of me for doing so. So there was all that. Again, while I'm talking, there's only like 2 or 3 of us here. If you've got questions or you want me to, talk about something in particular, I'll be happy to do so.
So you actually have 9 people viewing, and there's a couple questions that have come in.
Oh, why can't I see those? That makes me mad.
Yeah. No, you can. So if you click there's like
there they are, published.
There you go.
Yeah. What is my favorite part of the Yule book? I don't know what my favorite part is. I do like the weird traditions that are associated with Yule. One of my favorite is a figure called the Cagner, which comes from Catalonia, a region in Spain. And the Cagner literally translates as the shitter, though in nice Llewellyn speak, I could only call him the crapper. And so in Catalonian nativity scenes, you would have the Cagner there, and it would be like a young Catalonian peasant, and he's always kind of depicted as a peasant, and he'd have his pants down around his ankle taking a dump near Jesus and the nativity. And this has really perplexed people for a long time because it doesn't seem like something that you would want around a baby being born. It also feels kind of sacrilegious. Some people try to make it a fertility thing, like the peasant had nothing to give, so he gave his poop because he knew it would fertilize the earth. That's one particular interpretation of what it could mean. People use that one when they're trying to link it back to ancient paganisms, which is difficult because the figure doesn't really show up until the 17th century. So there's like a long period when it should have been there, when it wasn't. So it doesn't make sense that it's necessarily a pagan survival. Some people think it represents the idea within Christianity that none shall know the time or place of Jesus's return. So you're kind of caught off guard, meaning Jesus could come back, and of course you're in the middle of taking a dump, and that's supposed to be problematic or symbolizing something. I think it just might be a funny joke, because it is. It's sort of funny. I have like a little nativity scene where Jesus and the wise men and Mary and Joseph all look like trees, and I love it because it's really pagan looking. But I have a little tiny Cagner there, and he looks, he's just pooping in the background, and I think it's really funny. There's also another tradition that's similar, and it's from a similar part of France. It's like a Christmas log, and it's not like a Yule log that you would eat. It's a log that is allegedly sentient, and you decorate the log so it has eyes and it has a mouth, and it's usually just made out of like a standard log, and usually you put a cape sort of on the back end of the log so you can hide things under that. And this Christmas log, on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, depending on where you live, you beat it with a warm stick. So parents would warm sticks up on the oven. The kids would come in, and then they would beat the Christmas log with the sticks. And then when the kids were putting the sticks away, the parents would hide candy and toys underneath the sort of blanket part in the back of the Christmas log. And then the kids would come back in and they'd lift it up. And the idea is that the Christmas log pooped out gifts to them. It's just so weird. Like, there's some really, really strange customs around Christmas, especially in parts of Spain, apparently. So writing about those things, I think, is really great. In the United States, we have really sort of whittled down the holiday season to one day, Christmas, maybe kind of a second day, New Year's, where everybody gets drunk that night or something. But we've gotten rid of most of the rest of it. And then we've also simplified all the characters involved. So it's really just people around Santa and obviously Santa Claus. So we've taken out the Krampus, we've taken out Befana. There's really no way for these figures to come back in. And I think that's really sad, because there's this rich tapestry of figures and traditions that are mostly unknown to Americans, or have just sort of been pushed out of the wayside because of the predominance of Santa Claus. So that is my favorite part of the book, talking about these more obscure things. And I thought I knew a lot about Yule before I started the book, and I was always constantly surprised by some of the things I was finding out, like how long Christmas used to extend in parts of Europe, things like Plough Monday and how popular Twelfth Night was at one point. So that was really kind of exciting to me, those things that I didn't know. How do I feel about the stores bringing out all the Yuletide stuff super early, often before Samhain instead of letting it linger into January? I don't mind seeing it as early as November 1st, because it's my favorite part of the season. And really, if you think about Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas, or Samhain, Thanksgiving and Yule, they all kind of bleed together now in a lot of ways. And a lot of the traditions that we associate with those three particular holidays at some point was also associated with the other holidays. So for a long time in the United States, people in the Northeast did not really celebrate Yule. They were basically the granddaughters and grandsons of Puritans. Puritans hated Christmas because they knew what it was, an ancient pagan celebration. People back then, even in Puritan spaces, celebrated it by drinking a great deal and gambling, and often fornicating. So the authorities never liked it and always tried to stamp it out. So when Thanksgiving became a major holiday, a lot of the things that we associate with Christmas, like the scenes of winter, the idea of family coming home for this big holiday, was all sort of given to Thanksgiving in the Northeast for about 100, 200 years. And then later it sort of trickled back down to Christmas when the Puritan influence began to die out a little bit more. There's this really cool story of children in the 1920s in New York City dressing up in costumes and going door to door to businesses in downtown New York on Thanksgiving Day asking for treats, which is so weird to us because we would never associate Thanksgiving with anything like that. And that tradition only died because the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade became so big and so super important and like kind of dominant in New York. So it became like kind of a bigger thing than this sort of pseudo trick-or-treating people were doing. The phrase trick-or-treat, for instance, only dates from 1939. So all of these holidays are kind of like this mess. And in about the 1940s and in the early 1950s, for whatever reason, we decided that this piece is going to go here, this piece is going to go there. And only then did these holidays really settle into the forms that we really know them by today. So when the stuff comes out early for Yule and it's next to the Samhain stuff, I almost think it's sort of appropriate because they have such a shared and intertwined history in a lot of ways. I do wish it stayed out later. That's always my biggest sadness, is this idea that, okay, Christmas is December 25th and then December 26th, it's all over with, other than Lexus commercials. And I'm always really disappointed by how quickly people want to pack it away. I always let my lights stay out until December 14th or January 14th or January 15th. And so I like the lingering. I wish there was more of it. Elaine is killing it with questions. What is something about Christmas or Yule that we think of as ancient that really isn't? The one thing that's probably not as ancient as people would like is the tree. So we know that the Romans decorated with evergreen boughs and wreaths at the Saturnalia and at the January calends. And we know that the Norse did the same thing, but they didn't ever really bring full trees into their house. That would have been kind of a step too far. And it really feels like the first person to really have a Christmas tree, which is chopping the whole thing down and taking it inside, was probably Martin Luther. However, it's really not that different to take a tree in versus taking a couple of branches in, especially when you think of how small a lot of trees were or houses were back then. You couldn't really bring in an entire tree. So that's the one thing. There are a couple of things that people bring out every once in a while that look like sort of precedents for bringing in the whole tree into a house. There's a really interesting 3rd century picture of Dionysus with an evergreen tree behind him, and he's getting ready to celebrate some sort of winter holiday. However, we don't know that it was decorated and brought in. He could have just been bringing it to the party so they could cut off the different boughs or something and then take those inside. So the whole tree is different. And then decorating the entire tree is another step too, which apparently Martin Luther did and a few others. But that, again, it's pretty late, 1400s, 1500s. So it's not quite as ancient as maybe we would like it to be. I'm trying to think of others. For the most part, everything else dates at least really to the medieval period. There was a big change in how the holiday was celebrated, though, beginning in the 19th century. So for most of the history of Yuletide season, whether it was Roman or later Christian, it was really about the partying and the drinking, and it wasn't a children's holiday. In the early 19th century, the holiday changed, and instead of people going out and wassailing and asking for booze and then doing mean things to people who wouldn't give them booze, the holiday began to be centered on kids and being in your own living room. And a lot of this change occurred because of people in New York City in the early 1800s. One of the ideas was there was a newly emerging middle class, and that middle class was being asked for things, and that middle class did not want to give people who had less money than them things. Some of it might have been because they just didn't have that much pocket change. They weren't members of the nobility. Some of it might have been just because of selfishness, because it seems like there were some very wealthy people who just didn't want to play these ancient games. So they began writing stories to change the holiday. They began to really kind of sell the myth of Santa Claus and to make the holiday much, much more of a holiday about kids. Kids had been getting presents since at least the 12th century, which when some French nuns made up the story of St. Nicholas giving gifts to kids. But it hadn't been their holiday until the early 1800s. Some of that change also had to do with the emerging middle class, especially by the end of the century. For a long time, kids went right to work. Like by the time you were 6 or 7, you did things related to work. And as the middle class began to grow and leisure time began to grow, kids actually got to have a childhood. And getting to have a childhood meant Santa, and it meant presents at Christmas time. So that was really different and kind of a change. So if you all have any questions, love answering questions. If you don't want to talk about Christmas anymore, I might talk about the Horned God book, which is out in April or May, which is a long time. But one of the things about being a writer and kind of transitioning to being a writer full time is that, like, it's all I do now is I write books. And like right now I can tell you the next 3 years of my life, because I have 3 books that I'm going to write for Llewellyn over the next 3 years. The first one is called The Magic of the Witch, which is all about the different types of magic that witches use. And I'm about 20,000 words into that. So that's kind of exciting. And the second one is The Witch's Guide to the Greek Gods. And that I'm supposed to be done with next June. So I have like these 2 books with kind of really tight sort of turnaround times. But yeah, so it's like my life is books upon books upon books. I'm really happy about the Horned God book, and it's right here on my phone. So I'm gonna like read a little bit of this. It seems a little bit more seasonably appropriate to me than talking about Yule. And it's also the one that's been in my brain the most lately. I'm done with it. I've done my changes to the book. However, at the same time, you know, I'm still like looking back at it and thinking of different ways I could tinker with it and other stuff. And also, I'm just happy about it. I think it came out really, really well. So let's see what would be fun to read from that particular part of the book. I know what I want to read. So the book is about the history of the Horned God, kind of how that figure evolved and developed in modern witchcraft, and sort of about the things that enabled it to develop. So it spends a lot of time talking about Pan and Kronos in the ancient world, and then some time talking about modern things that have influenced when we talk about like the greater Horned God. One of the things that makes me the saddest is if you look at the sort of history of the Horned God, especially in Wicca, he's been downplayed over the last 30 years especially. I think some of that is because of satanic panic. People were very scared of connecting anything about Wicca to anything that might be considered the devil. And I think that applied to the Horned God. So this is a little excerpt from the book. Let me take a little sip of something first. This is from chapter 16, From Horned God to the God, the Horned One in Wicca. Wiccan witchcraft's primary male deity has always been the Horned God. In recent years, this has sometimes gotten lost as people talk of the God or the Lord instead of the Horned One. I don't mean to suggest that it's wrong to honor the sun god or the sea god or whatever other deity someone wants to place in their circle. Only at the beginning of Wicca, the god of the witches was nearly always horned or had attributes that we think of as belonging to the Horned God. While this section is mostly focused on the evolution of the Horned God within texts most of us would think of as Wiccan, nearly all of those texts use the word witch exclusively. Because of this, I use Wiccan and witch and witchcraft and Wicca as synonyms here, because that's how they were generally used in the books I'm referencing. In 1958's The Meaning of Witchcraft, Gerald Gardner provides his most thoughtful explanation of the Horned God of the Witches. In just a few sentences, he links his witch god to life, death, Pan, the king of the wood, and perhaps surprisingly to some, the 2-headed Roman god Janus. Now we have seen that Janus or Dianus was a form of the god of the witches. The 2 faces depict his dual nature. As the witch ritual says, thou art the opener of the doorway of the womb, and yet, because that which is born must also die, that it may be renewed. Therefore art thou lord of the gates of death. Being the consort of Diana, he was the king of the wood, and as the phallic god, he was the renewer of life. It is evident that the bust which Lady Raglan illustrates depicts him as the renewer of life in spring. The green leaves take life from his mouth. Closely akin to him are Faunus and Sylvanus and Pan, who hailed in Hellas as Pamphage, all devourer, all begetter, beloved savior of the world, yet from whose name was derived panic as a term of terror. Priapus too was the phallic god and the god of gardens. The concept of fertility, of eternal, ever-renewing, aspiring life is the basis of them all. Here, Gardner's god is cosmic and all-encompassing. He's one being, but he's also Pan, Priapus, Janus, the Green Man, the King of the Wood, and the Lord of the Gates of Death. He's the joyous god of the eternal English countryside, but he's also a deity with one foot, or hoof, planted firmly in the afterlife. In Witchcraft Today, Gardner wrote that, while the gods wished them well, they, the gods, were not all powerful, that they needed man's help, that by performing certain rites men gave them power. Perhaps a phallic renewer of life and the Lord of the gates of death is not quite all powerful, but at least he has to come close. When reading Gardner, I sometimes feel as if his horn god is two separate deities. There's the horn god of the witches, a rather intimate deity who appeals only to witches and whose origins are in the green earth and humanity before pre-recorded history. This is the version of the god who is not all powerful. Next to this figure is one of the, quote, two pillars which support the universe, of which, quote, every manifestation of male and female is a manifestation of them. This can be taken to mean that gods such as Yahweh or Jehovah are also a manifestation of the witch's god. Though I don't think it was Gardner's intention, the end result of these more cosmic musings would later have ramifications and allowed the horn god to get lost in other manifestations of deity. Instead of continuing to be the primary male god of the Wicca, the door was now open to other possibilities. In later years, the horn god would be looked at by many as simply one aspect of a greater whole, the end result being that many began to overlook some of the roles he played in Wicca's earliest published literature. When discussing the history of any modern witchcraft tradition, books are especially important. Until relatively recently, the only way to really learn about a tradition such as Wicca was through direct contact with the Wiccan or through the pages of a book. There have been influentials over the last 50 years who haven't left much in the way of a written legacy, but the biggest shapers of witchcraft as a whole have been writers. For many of us, they have been our entryway into Wicca and other forms of witchcraft. At its beginning, Wiccan witchcraft was an initiation-only tradition. To become a Wiccan witch required an initiation into an existing coven. That changed over time, but for the first 20 years of Wicca's existence, the only way to obtain Wiccan ritual was to become an initiate, or perhaps write one's own rituals. That began to change in 1970 with the publication of Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft, a practical guide for witches, warlocks, and covens. Mastering Witchcraft is a brilliant piece of witchcraft writing. Many traditional witches think of it as a foundational work, and there's certainly a lot in it that is very different from Wiccan witchcraft. But there's also a great deal of Wiccan material in its pages, and the book's last chapter, The Coven and How to Form One, is basically about forming a Wiccan-style coven. The horned one features prominently in Hewson's book, but extra attention is also paid to Crononos as the, quote, so-called witch deity. Hewson's writings on Crononos are fascinating because it's a version of Crononos that's alien from the deity I know in many respects. Hewson explicitly links Crononos to Pan to such an extent that you start to wonder if Crononos has goat horns atop his head instead of antlers. This is a quote from Hewson. The goat is the age-old representation of lust and debauchery, and Crononos himself, for such is his witch name, is frequently represented as possessing the cloven hooves, horns, and erect phallus of his attribute. His symbolism has much in common with the Greek god Pan. Whenever you wish to perform a spell whose object is to boggle someone's mind with lust, you should invoke only Crononos. If you're familiar at all with Crononos, you know that he has the antlers of a stag atop his head, and he does not have cloven hooves or goat legs. This is a really sort of different version of the god. The use of Crononos as Wiccan witchcraft's primary or most important male deity would be repeated in other books published in the 70s. In Lady Sheba's Book of Shadows, the god and goddess of the witches are said to be Arita and Crononos with a K, and those names are repeated several times throughout the text. In her spring equinox ritual, Sheba calls Crononos the merciful son of Carowin and states that his name is highest of all, which there is no historical basis for. Contemporary to Sheba, Valiente and Hewson was the English witch Sybil Leek, who released The Complete Art of Witchcraft in 1971. Instead of naming the horn god Crononos, she called her horn god Faunus, generally seen as the Roman equivalent of Pan. Her description of Faunus generally falls in line with other descriptions of the horn god. He is, quote, the spirit within the woods, trees, and waters. She also explicitly links him to the sun. Her Faunus is, quote, the sun, the life-giving force, without which there could be no life at all. Crononos again is used as the name of the Wiccan horn god in 8 Sabbats for Witches and The Witch's Way, published in the early 80s, and later republished in one volume as The Witch's Bible by Janet and Stuart Farrar, with some assistance from Doreen Valiente. 8 Sabbats for Witches and The Witch's Way would be some of the last Wiccan books to portray the horn god as the unquestioned god of the witches, and to include a specific deity name from antiquity. What Gardner hinted at in 1959, the god as a manifestation of all deities, would become the most common way of writing about the god of Wiccan witches as the years rolled along. Writers would mention the horn god, of course, but he became something bigger than a more intimate deity concerned primarily with witches. Perhaps the greatest expression of this change can be found in The Spiral Dance by Starhawk, published in 1979. Unlike the previous authors written about in this chapter, Starhawk drew inspiration for her version of witchcraft from sources far beyond British Wiccan traditions. Starhawk's version of witchcraft was heavily influenced by Wicca, but also second-wave feminism, Dianic witchcraft, and perhaps most importantly, the work of Victor and Cora Anderson, founders of the Anderson fairy tradition. The Spiral Dance by Starhawk calls the god of the witches by several different names, including Horn God, the God, Sun Child, Lord of the Winds, and Dying God. Starhawk's witch god is cosmic, all-encompassing, but beholden to the goddess. Starhawk writes that the horn god is born of a virgin mother, and that, quote, his power is drawn directly from the goddess. He participates in her, unquote. While the goddess has always been somewhat predominant in many forms of Wiccan witchcraft, the Wicca of Gardner and his descendants generally viewed goddess and god as equals in terms of power and agency. Here the horned god is no pushover, but obviously in a secondary role. Starhawk's conception of the god of the witches is not one that arose in isolation and was symptomatic of larger trends. So that's a little bit from my book, The Horned God of the Witches, which will be out in the spring of next year. I'm just very excited about it, and I don't think people have written about a lot of these things before. They certainly have never written about the history of the Horned God as found within modern Wiccan texts. There's also a whole section about how the Horned God is talked about in the tradition of traditional witchcraft as well, which is really much more in line with how he was written about in early Wicca. So very, very excited about that particular book, and I can't wait to share it. I'm hoping it'll be out by convocation, but it won't be. But I have some plans to get it into the hands of people from Michigan before it gets into the hands of anyone else. So our time is about up. If anybody has questions, I love questions. If you don't have questions, I always just feel like I've been very successful in my rambling for the last 45 minutes. Maybe I haven't. You know, everybody's so quiet.
There's about a 20-second delay, so.
All right. Well, I'll just happily sip this coffee for a second. But I'm like, I actually hate writing books. So when they're done, that's when I actually start appreciating them again.
That's fair.
It's often like pulling teeth while you're writing it. And then when you're done, you look at it and you're like, I cannot believe that I wrote this. This is totally not terrible. And that's always exciting.
I think some women feel that way about pregnancy and birth. They don't enjoy the process, but then the outcome is like, oh yeah, okay, I like it.
Yeah, I don't have any kids, but you know, my books are like my babies in a way.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be here hopefully long after I'm gone.
Okay, I don't think we have any other questions coming in.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming out and saying hi and being here. It's always nice to reconnect with people from Michigan area because I miss all of you quite a bit.
Thank you very much for your time. It was a wonderful lecture and discussion.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you all later.
All right.